So hello everyone. Sorry, I had technical problems. So this is the second part of the second part mainly, and we stopped by looking at a quote here from Thomas Bedürftig, which is on the notion of fiction in regard or in relation to Leibniz, and what kind of the crux was is that today we might have some some straight up connotations in regard of the word fiction, so that we might associate it with fantasy or nonsense or some fictitious narrative. But what we saw in that quote is that the term fiction, as Leibniz is using it, has some really other, let's say, some really other context to it. So the kind of the uptake to it is that that Leibniz is using this notion operationally in terms of mathematical his mathematical work and investigation into the imaginary numbers. So the imaginary numbers are really well defined, even though they are something outstanding in the realm of numbers. And Leibniz is expressing his curiosity towards being able to work with them in a mathematical manner, to work with numbers that are irrational and that are constructed in terms of sets of other numbers. So. And I think what we can take up from this is that how we usually use the word fiction today. This has a lot of baggage to carry, or has a lot of baggage to it, right? So the notion fiction ranges from imagination and something like mental form, which we might also associate with the form of thought, with something mental, with kind of like a mental entity, something that is purely of the mind. And it ranges even to something like fantasy and nonsense. And right, so the last two notions or way of usage, so fantasy and nonsense, are perhaps the most prevalent today when we kind of speak in an everyday vernacular. So I want to stress here that we should try to bracket these connotations and kind of also bracket our assumptions that we might bring with us the best way possible when we try to engage with something like the uncanny, and then again with the notion of fiction or fictitious literature. So the notion of being fictional in terms of literature. So we should bracket our assumptions, and it's undoubted that we bring some pre-understanding with us, something that we connect with the word fiction. And we kind of have an idea in the sense of we have already a concept, something that we understand by it, or when we hear the word fiction. But we should be, careful not to preemptively, not to preempt on this notion, and kind of what it can mean, or how it is used in the context that Freud is using it or situating it. So approximatively, and for the first part, we we bracket our assumptions and our connotations in regard of that notions, and we this is kind of the paradigmatic case in terms of the notion of fiction, but we can also make this case in terms of notions such as unconscious, the unconscious, or repression. So all these terms are technical terms, and they are used really in a specific way and manner, so in a specific context, and always in relation to other notions, and kind of like in philosophy, kind of always in a difference to how these notions are used in an everyday sense, at least most of the time. So then again, I have another quote before we go finally towards the primary source. So I'm always saying we're heading towards the primary source, and then I come up with other quotes. But this is mainly due to the difficulty to kind of grapple with the primary sources, and it's really helpful in a way to read into it, and then to if one get a first understanding, to at least that's how I conceive of it, to get help with some with some other not secondary literature, but with some other kind of good way of of explaining what is kind of what are the perhaps the mechanisms, and I mean in quotation marks, mechanisms at work in the argumentation, or what is specifically helpful in terms of getting a grip on the primary source and the way it is kind of built. So and I think that the notion of fiction is especially important when we come to The Uncanny by Sigmund Freud, or when we dive into that text. And so I have another quote which will be also, I hope, really helpful. And this is, here it is. So it's a quote by, it's a quote by a text that is called The Making of an International Collective Art, and it's by Vladimir Glover. And so I will quote here from page 149. And I will start with let's start here with the ready-made. The ready-made non-artistic object, which is deprived of beauty, is thus a non-generality. It is an irreducible particularity, a presence, and a force which flees representation. As such, it is close to the real, but not reality, which is something unknown. The real is coeval with the Freudian uncanny. It is something that escapes conscious mental activity. It is beyond sense and sensibility. The real is, by definition, the impossible. As such, it coincides with the id, das Es, or the Freudian unconscious, as an exteriority which is the limit of subjectivity or its negativity. The materiality and concreteness of the object represented in surrealist and constructivist art is ambivalent. Although apparently reduced to its basic materiality and uniqueness, the surrealist object nevertheless remains a representation. It signifies. Even if it signifies nothing, it nevertheless signifies. Moreover, the object signifies in space and not in time. The object is always a spatial object. As a spatial object, the object is always present, and yet it is nowhere. This presence is thus equivocal, for the object is a dual entity. It is an object in space and a representation. As representation, the object is refracted or specularized. In other words, in its doubling as an image, it loses something of its presence to the process of signification, which relies on interpretation. In order to interpret an object, a perceiving subject has to refer the object to a concept or sign. This involves a deferral in time which dislodges the object from its present spatiality and relocates it on another scene, which is always the scene of absence. This other scene is the scene of the unconsciousness, or of the unconscious, in which concepts or signs are generated in much the same way as dreams or thoughts, namely as wishes, in brackets hallucinations or daydreams. The surrealist concrete and present object thus comes to signify its opposite, namely absence. The concrete represented object is thus not itself, but an invisible and uncanny absence in which it originates as image or as second-order reality. This is the reality of the unconscious, or of the Freudian uncanny, in brackets das Unheimliche, which are by definition unrepresentable. The surrealist object, which at first approach appears to be a presence in space, turns out to be a representation of absence, and as such, a substitution for the unrepresentable. To represent the unrepresentable, surrealism constructed the metaphors of space and silence. These came to simulate state of affairs, a spatially conceived relational condition of possibility of all signification. So, there's a lot in this quote, but yeah, let's unpack just a bit of it that is mainly relevant, because we didn't introduce yet terms like the unconscious, but there is a reference to the uncanny, and right, so yeah, so signs are generated in much the same way as dream or thoughts, namely as wishes. So this is much about signage or signage production, and so also when you read the term representation, so there's something represented, there is a reference, an act of referring or reference, so something is referring to something else. This is on a basic level the definition of a sign. So something stands in for something else, represents something else, is referring to something else. And in order to interpret an object, a perceiving subject has to refer the object to a concept or sign. This involves a different time which dislodges the object from its present spatiality and relocates it on another scene, which is always the scene of an absence. This other scene is the scene of the unconscious. So what I want to stress in this quote, and I mean there's a lot packed in there and even notions that we didn't even introduce yet, but what I want to emphasize is this sentence on page 150. And it says, quote, "In order to interpret an object, a perceiving subject has to refer the object to a concept or sign. This involves a deferral in time which dislodges the object from its present spatiality and relocates it on another scene, which is always the scene of an absence. This other scene is the scene of the unconscious." So, so we talked about, or we talked in terms of the previous quote, which was about the tuned or intonated space, and we talked about in this context about the lack of intentionality in terms of this attuned or intonated spatiality that we got a description of in the last quote. And now we see that there can be allegedly the possibility of a dislodgement of an object from its present spatiality, and then again its relocation to another scene. But this scene is the scene of an absence, as it says, and in that sense there's no presentational content of the object anymore, right? It seems there's nothing to be represented, because it's the scene of an absence. So it's not a scene of presentifiable, identifiable content, something that is that is strictly outlined, or that can be grasped in its form and be fully identified. It's rather that on this scene of absence, there is nothing to be represented anymore. We must have we have no. Another way to say this is that it seems that we don't have an access to the scene of absence. In a manner, we have an access to a scene of presence, to something where we can identify content, and where we can like differentiate a figure from the ground and bring it into a form, into a coherent form, or into a coherent picture, right? So there seems to be a cut, or a differentiation, a cleavage, if you want so. And on this scene of the absence, there seems to be the trait that there is nothing to be represented. So, and the text even speaks here, right, from on page 149, it says, right, that the surrealist object nevertheless remains a representation. It signifies, even if it signifies nothing, it nevertheless signifies. So what kind of I think is referring to this trait of the surrealist art movement, or like this kind of art approach, that they try to signify this nothing, that they try to bring that into a symbolization. So they try to signify this nothing, or this kind of trait that is the scene of absence, or what is missing in the picture, right? And they try to symbolize it by means of presentifiable content or representational content. And there is kind of the dynamic, or the tension between, like, let's say, surrealist art and some realistic art, right? But because the realistic art can right, they can identify what they want to present on the image, right? So they are, if you make a realistic painting, for example, you can paint what you normally would identify in a scene, like, let's say, some trees, a landscape, a lake, and so you have a realistic, let's say, land art painting. But the surrealists are, right, they're approaching something different. They're approaching something like the unconscious, or something like the psyche, and it's kind of peculiarities, and there kind of faces the problem of absence, or of withdrawal, of something which cannot be represented nevertheless, which is a kind of specifically delicate topic for art. Okay, so we have to keep that in mind, that to be representable, or to be able to represent something, we must have some form of objectifiable content, some content that is present. And if that is not the case, we might lack the constituting condition for any form of intentionality, right? Because intentionality is always intentionality of something. So this doesn't have to be like let's say, a physical object. So let's say a tree that we would normally assume to be standing apart from us. So face something that is facing us, and that is standing in our environment. But right, so in terms of intentionality, that could be also like a mental object, something that we wish or that we will. So I mean, this is just to say that that intentionality is always or is like the condition of intentionality is the directedness and the setting up of an object that is the intentional content. And but this seems to miss here when with regard to the scene of an absence, where there's so we have a perceiving subject which can we kind of refer and identify an object and can assign a concept or sign to it. So mainly whenever and wherever there is a perceiving subject which can refer and identify an object and can assign a concept or sign to it, we have this specific dynamic, right, where we have these moments of intentionality. So there is identification of an object and the referring to an object, and the assigning of a concept or sign to that object that is referred to, that is identified. And so this is on the side of intentionality. And then there's this kind of deferral by means of assigning a concept or sign to that object. This deferral of time and dislodgement spatially towards the scene of an absence. And this dynamic is also what is peculiar and what will become relevant in terms of the uncanny we will see.